I have been pretty good. I mean, we're trying to navigate all of this stuff that's going on with,
Yeah.
how do we do church in the time of COVID-19? You know, how do we act faithfully in the midst of everything that's going on in our society right now?
Right.
Which, again, was one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you, just because I know there are things that, frankly, I don't see or that
Hmm.
I don't understand just because I've not lived them or I've not experienced them.
Right.
And I know that for many of the people who I work with, they don't have that experience.
Yeah.
So sometimes, and I think a lot of times we're afraid to ask.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and I think that's something that we all have to work on, right? We all have to become vulnerable. And you have to be vulnerable enough to ask me, and I have to be vulnerable enough to allow you to ask me and answer honestly while being unoffended. Right. So I think that's the key. But I'm glad that you reached out, and it's been a crazy time for me. Just with all of this going on, like you said, with COVID, and then with the social unrest. But not just with that. Personally, my wife just had a baby a week ago, and so we're trying to navigate that with multiple kids. Now we have to play zone defense. So it's we're trying to adjust. But no, I appreciate it.
Yeah. Well, congratulations to you and your family. I know it's challenging. It's hard to believe my youngest is now graduating high school this year. So
Ooh, congratulations.
yeah, so I'll have two in college.
Oh well, yeah, congrats, but I feel
Hey,
you. I feel
there's a light at the end of the tunnel.
right. Ooh. Yeah, sorry we couldn't do this in person. My schedule's been really up in the air because of that. And then also, I took off from work because I'm actually bivocational,
Yeah,
and so took off from work. But having this time, it's really always up in the air when you have a newborn and what to expect, along with other kids around in the house. So it's always interesting.
absolutely. Well, again, I appreciate you making the time to do this. I know, again, I know all of our schedules are kind of up in the air, and especially being bivocational, I know that's a real challenge to navigate.
Hmm.
Well, I'll go ahead and start with kind of the first question. Being, when we started talking about this, you mentioned wanting to be unfiltered when we
Hmm.
talk, and I know that sometimes there are times where we feel like we have to filter ourselves, or we have to tread carefully when we talk about certain things. Can you talk about ways where you feel like you're filtered, or have been filtered in the past, or tread
Wow.
carefully when talking about racism?
Yeah. Well, one, being a pastor, you tend to, there's some things that you publicly and definitely from the pulpit, you make sure that you're filtered, right? Um, and so that in of itself is one. But when we're talking about race, it's different. As a black man and as a black pastor, there are two sides of it, right? There's one in which I feel that you have to filter in your everyday conversations with the general public, but also within the black subculture, right? As a black man. And let me explain that. One, um, I said I'm bivocational. So when you're talking about filtering, you filter. You hold back some of your personality, you hold back some of your true thoughts because you don't want to be characterized as an angry black man or fit into a particular category and treated as such. So therefore, you naturally filter it. Many people understand what I'm talking about parents than you do with your buddies when you're a kid, right? When you're a kid and you're in front of your parents, you're on your best behavior. But if you're in front of your buddies, you're just letting loose, and there's no telling what you might say, right?
Yeah,
So you tend to have that. Now the now that's normal for most people, but from an African American standpoint, we do that, or you may see that because you don't want to come off being threatening or angry or to fit the stereotype or the stigma that has already been concocted, right, historically. So you become more reserved. There are aspects of your voice and voice inflection you're very careful about. These are things that I was taught as a young man, right, growing up, is that you're very careful about those things. So there are certain things you won't say. Now, on the flip side, on the Black side, there's still
Okay, you there? I think we kind of jammed up a little bit.
show, and sometimes you may, do that even more so um, by focusing on the struggle. So I want to stop here and just ask you: can you hear me okay? Am I choppy or anything like that? I want to make sure.
We've had a few moments where it's gotten choppy, where it seems like it freezes for just a second.
Mm-hmm.
So
Well, let me do this. One of the things that I do is I'll cut off computer audio and I'll go directly to phone audio while you'll see my video.
okay.
So I'll dial in at the same time, and that may help. Because I know I have to do that sometimes, even for my Zoom calls.
Yeah. All these things of navigating technology that, again, nobody trained you for in seminary.
Right.
Okay. So I think we've got you audio on phone now.
Yes, and I have cut my audio on the computer.
Okay.
So hopefully that answers the question in regards to being filtered. And then on top of that, I want us both to be comfortable. I want you to be comfortable asking me whatever. I've had these discussions. I've been having these discussions since I think my first time really having a serious discussion about this was back in 1996.
Yeah.
So I've been doing this for a long time. So there's nothing you can say that will offend me. There's nothing you can say that I will look at you and say, oh, that's a dumb question. So I want you to feel comfortable in asking me whatever it is, whatever your heart's desire. I want you to feel comfortable, and I'll answer it directly.
Okay. Well, let's talk a little bit about recent. So we've had they had the video of Ahmaud Arbery being killed by two white men. You had the death of George Floyd when he was pinned underneath the knee of a policeman. I know there's also the less publicized case from a couple months ago of Breonna Taylor, who was shot in her own home by plainclothes policemen entering. How did those deaths impact you? What did they bring up? And did it connect to this long history of the way, at least my understanding, Black men and women have felt that the system doesn't apply fairly to them when it comes to law enforcement?
Yeah, that's a really good question. Each of those, when you look at them, the result, you see someone being killed, but how it's done is different. Breonna Taylor, when you look at that example, we were following the rules, right? So she was a healthcare worker. Her boyfriend had a gun that was registered and legal within his rights to have with his home. When you have anyone in plain clothes storming your house, your natural impulse is to protect your home. So we were following the rules. And with that one stung because even when you're following the rules the result can be catastrophic.
Yeah.
And then following that, now he's been released, but following that, they took him into custody, right? And so so that one stung because, hey, we're following the rules. What are we supposed to do when we follow the rules and the rules don't apply? There are other cases where we're following the rules. Philando Castile in Minneapolis, again, was following the rules. He let the officers know, hey, I do have a weapon. It is registered, but it's in my glove box. And I've taken gun classes and the CHL classes and whatnot. And they tell you, hey, let them know, yes, I do have a weapon. So he was following the rules and was shot and killed. So those typically, those really, really sting, because the question is, what do we do now, right? It's like the goalposts are moving, right? George Floyd had a different impact on me because George Floyd was originally from Houston, Texas. And he, for me, I didn't know him personally, but we were 1 degree of separation. I knew many of the people that he knew from his high school. Like I grew up and lived down the street from his high school a part of my life. So I know the area and knew several people that knew him. So it was 1 degree of separation. And so personally, that hits, right? It's like that could have been either one of us, right? At any given moment, any given time. So that hits home. You know, in relation to Ahmaud Arbery, that one hits home differently because he was, for lack of a better term, he was hunted. You know, when you look at the video, he was hunted, and that's altogether different, right? So now we're forced to reconcile those 3 cases, and they happen so quickly, right after one another. And how do you reconcile those 3 cases? So it's different. 1, you're being hunted. 2, you know, it's close to home, and it could be either one of us. And 3, what happens when you follow the rules, right? So it's a tough thing to grasp, and it's a tough thing to explain to your children because many adults are having trouble to reconcile that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and again, then you also have, I know, other public instances where, again, you're just doing normal things. You know, going to a Starbucks or bird watching, or I think are some of the recent ones. You know,
right.
You get the police called on you.
Yeah, you know, the guy in New York, in Central Park, you know, he was again following the rules. The sign said, "Hey, dogs should be on a leash," and then at that point, that one really publicized what we have experienced many times over, and that was the weaponizing of what we consider white privilege. Going even back to the days of Emmett Till back in Mississippi in 1945, or not 1955, I'm sorry, but Emmett Till, who was from the Midwest and traveled to Mississippi, allegedly whistled at a white woman, but was murdered, right? Again, the weaponization of that, and there are countless cases where that has taken place, and even throughout cases that we don't hear about, where people know that, hey, all I have to do is say a black man is threatening my life, and you know that's a trigger word, right? So that one is tough, and he was a respectable man. And he was just basically, and he was actually a part of the association, if not leading an association that actually created the exhibit in Central Park. So he had business there, right? So, you know, those types of things are just things that we've had to face all of our lives. And those are lessons that we've been taught all of our lives, but now it's being publicized.
Well, and again, I think it was Will Smith, but somebody had said earlier, you know, it's not that these things didn't happen before, it's just they're now being videoed.
Yeah, absolutely.
And again, I know that the proliferation of, you know, cell phones that have videos on them has made some of this easy to video that wouldn't have been easy to video, you know, 10, 15
Right.
years ago. But I'll also confess on my own naivety on this. I grew up in San Antonio. I spent 5 years in the Army before going to seminary in Louisiana. And I knew that there were, for example, in Louisiana, there were places that we as soldiers were not to go because of, Leesville and other places in Louisiana. Don't go to these places because there is a history of action towards minorities, and being in the military, I mean, you had a wide range of people from different ethnic backgrounds, and
Right.
but again, I mean, perhaps this was a naivety on my part. I mean, I felt like, in the generation I think we were both a part of, and my children's generation, there was a part of me that said things seem like they're getting better, like that we're moving in the right direction.
Mm-hmm.
And I would have said that until a couple of years ago, and then it seems like either we've taken a step back, or maybe we're just seeing what was already always there. And maybe, and I'll be the first to admit that maybe is my naivety of not seeing what was always there.
Yeah, one, I think how we recognize progress may be different, right? Each person may recognize progress differently. We have made progress, right? I remember my mother telling me the stories of trying to vote. My parents grew up in Mississippi, and so they witnessed church bombings. They witnessed a lot of those things, and so there's some things that I've been afforded that she was never afforded at that time. So that in relation to that, that's progress. Now, is it as much progress as we would like? No, I mean, okay, we can talk about that. But for let's say sometimes we recognize progress differently, right? Because if that's not something that you had to face, that's not a criteria for your progress. And a lot of times, just human nature is to think that everyone's experience is as your experience. So when I was growing up, I thought that everyone, lived the way that I lived because that's all I was experiencing. It wasn't until I went off to school to say, hey, y'all didn't live like this, but so that's natural, right? But it's not until you're exposed to others' experiences and you have a heart for understanding and compassion to understand where they're coming from that you can start to absorb that and compartmentalize and do what you need to do with it.
Absolutely. And again, I mean, the only way I know how to learn is from other people, and to hear their stories, to hear their experiences. I mean, I know that's one of the gifts of being a pastor for me is going and hearing, the people I've served stories, but then also people in the community stories. And yet, again, I know sometimes you go in with that assumption of, hey, you're seeing the same thing I'm seeing, and it's not always true. So.
Right.
Within that, are there ways in which, the experience of racism has become camouflaged better or have you, or maybe it just is always there and again, a white blindness, for lack of a better way of saying it, to what is there?
Yeah. It was forced under the covers, right? So history, when segregation basically became, illegal, we moved from segregationist ideas. It became more systemic, right? Which is what you're hearing, systemic racism. You see illustrations of that through historical redlining, right? And those aspects. So it became more systemic. And so yeah, there's some things that in which the system now supports those types of things. And so when a system was created to support those types of ideas and ideals, what has happened is it has built a culture or foundation for a culture that rests on those ideals. And it's just now inherent. And so you now have an over-policing of of Black neighborhoods, right? And how did those neighborhoods become that way to begin with? With racist policies, right? Through redlining and whatnot. So, and then when you start looking at those neighborhoods and you start looking at the lack of investment that's being made in many of those areas, you start to see how other disparities start to take shape. You know, one of the primary killers of Black people are heart disease and diabetes, right? So what types of foods exist in those neighborhoods? You start seeing food deserts, right? Because there are no investments. You don't see grocery chains with fresh vegetables and foods and whatnot. There are a lot of processed foods. And then there's a limitation on healthcare, right? Access to opportunities and jobs, education. So you start to see, you know, just layer upon layer, our children and various adults struggling with the opportunities to just really live. So yeah, it has become more covert. Now, you do have other types of policies that may be sprinkled in there that you know, maybe even more hidden, but those are just some of the examples that we've seen. So yeah, it has become more covert.
Yeah. You know, I was watching the news yesterday with the elections in Georgia, and again, I know the experience of voting in Frisco, for example, is typically very painless. You know, you know, if you have a 20-minute wait, that's a long wait a lot of times.
Right.
And seeing incredibly long lines that were just stretching, and again, people trying to keep spacing in the midst of it, but just having these drone shots of long lines where, you know, voting, while it may be available, it's going to take you hours and hours and hours to do something that, again, should be a very simple process. And again, I don't know, maybe we're just seeing this again, or maybe this is a new way in which, again, racism is rearing its ugly head. But it did feel like there was a certain, for lack of a better way of saying, disenfranchisement of the communities that were trying to vote in Georgia. Yeah,
you know, I know they have a chaotic situation. Some of that can be attributed to new technology and new voting machines, right? And lack of training and logistical procedures to accommodate, you know, all of that. But then when you start looking at voting practices and different requirements to vote over the years, even to this day, we see policies that seem to be unfavorable to minority communities from a voting standpoint. We see redrawing of districts that tend to be unfavorable to minority communities from those standpoints. So, you know, it's a little easier to vote than when my mother was coming up, but you still have some challenges, and some states have adopted some challenging policies for some of their voters. But you know, Frisco, we're insulated, right? We have different problems, and so Frisco, its growth and its affluence, so to speak, we're a little insulated. And so when we hear those things, we're like, oh wow, you know, it's so easy in Frisco. How come everybody isn't like Frisco? And so you know, Frisco, we have done a great job in doing some things, especially handling processes like that. But Frisco also, you know, may have its challenges, but you know, we're a little insulated from the rest of, you know, what everyone else may be going through in places like Michigan or in places like Georgia, right?
Absolutely agree. And I know that for better or worse, I've served in a lot of suburban contexts. So I served in Edmond, Oklahoma, which is a suburb of Oklahoma City. You know, Edmond schools were very different than Oklahoma City schools. Frisco schools probably very different than Dallas ISD schools.
Yeah.
No problem, I guess, in there. But you know, but I did get to see a little bit when I served in North Little Rock. And, you know, again, just knowing that, I remember when I moved from Little Rock to Edmond, and they were opening a brand new school that my son was going to go to, and it was just the realization of, man, I never had a school like this. You know, this is like going into a movie theater. And it was, it was nice. And again, it was a realization of, okay, yeah, this is the kind of the bubble that I'm living in, and I know at some level, although I'm experiencing this right now, that this is not what everybody experiences.
Right. Right.
So we're both leaders of faith communities, and we're both people who faith is a very, very important part of our lives. You know, how does your faith inform the ways in which you help both you yourself personally and your community try to respond to systemic racism, to issues of discrimination?
That's an excellent question. I think I'm probably different from the majority of Black pastors, and the reason is because for much of, you know, I'm going to mention Black church and white church and all that. I hate those terms, but they're out there. So for much of the Black church, we've based a lot of our theology on what we call liberation theology, right? Needing to be saved because of our history. And so much of the response has to do with being in the struggle and possibly providing some hope to overcome the struggle. But it also rests in the understanding of our Blackness. So for me, though, I think that's limiting. See, for me to be a Black man is limiting when I compare it to me being a child of God. So there's nothing above being a child of God, right? Except being God, right? So I know I'm not God. But anything less than that limits the possibilities. And it limits me, and it actually keeps me in the struggle and focused on the struggle. So as a Black pastor, I realize I can't lead people out of the struggle if I'm staying in the struggle mentally, spiritually, and emotionally. So my response is always, what does God say? From a child of God perspective, how do I look at this? From a kingdom of God perspective, how am I supposed to look at this? So that identity, it overshadows and it outweighs any cultural or vocational affiliation I may align myself with. So that's first and foremost how I have to look at it. That may be different because the struggle is emotional. Look at the emotionalism that we see today, right? So, and it's really hard. It takes spiritual intentionality to break out of the emotionalism of the moment, right? So when we're looking at that, I have to be intentional to break out of that. So that's where my response starts. And seeing that that's where my response starts, I'm also able to look from a perspective of, okay, Black church, white church, we're both missing it here. And so I'm able to look at that objectively. The other part of that is that from a Black perspective, I have to demystify any of the rumors, myths, or whatever that have historically been floating out there within Black culture in regards to Christianity. And I'll give an example. You know, some people may say, well, Christianity is the white man's religion. Christianity was used to enslave Black people, or it was created. What they often say is it was created to enslave Black people. Well, you went to seminary, I went to seminary. I know historically, studying church history, that's so far from the truth, right? That African nations were Christianized long before 1492 when Columbus sailed the ocean blue. So I understand that that is a myth, but it's a myth that has gained some type of traction, and it has limited people's ability to really grow in their understanding of who they are in Christ. And so I also find myself having to focus on breaking down some of those barriers that have been created internally from outside influences, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and again, I mean, I know both of us have probably seen times where I think both of us could use language that we would both say that, you know, the Bible is intended to liberate us. And we've also probably seen lots of times where the Bible has been used by people to oppress others.
Right.
You know, and you can certainly use the Bible in many ways that are unfaithful to it, and it has been historically at times. But that doesn't minimize the gift of what the Bible should be to whatever culture or to whatever individual receives it.
Absolutely.
You know, and I understand kind of the a little bit on the white church, black church, because again, I serve a denomination that is the whitest denomination in the United States. You know, and part of that comes from, well, where did Lutherans come from? But the other reality is that, well, most of us have been here over 100 years, and we've not integrated with the society around us real well.
Yeah.
And part of that is honestly, you know, we've not had some of these conversations, and you know, we may not. There's sometimes I think that, for lack of a better way of saying, sometimes church, we expect people to come in and be like us, rather than meeting people where they are and trying to communicate the gospel where they are.
Yeah, that's an interesting statement. You know, a lot of times, what we see is, you know, I call it the outside in approach. Hey, invite everyone, come from the outside, come in, conform, be like us. Let us create programs so that you can feel comfortable being like us. You know, whereas when we look at the first century church, it was an inside out approach, right? It was let's learn, let's grow, let's understand, let's have experiences in God, and let's go out. That's why Jesus said, go and make disciples, right? So it was an inside out approach. So, you know, and having that outside in approach, it does, I guess, put blinders on to what's going on, because we're only focused on what's in front of us. And it really hinders us from being able to, I think, Big C church, for the church to really have an impact in society and in the communities around us.
You know, maybe we can end with hope. And you know, I don't know. I don't think it's his most important thing that he ever wrote or spoke, but it certainly is most popular when Martin Luther King was talking about his dream up in Washington. You know, about his dream for his children and what that would look like. You know, I know that the world today is not the world I want to pass on to my kids. You know, there are things that I would love to say to change. There are things I would like for them not to experience, and I would hope for your children not to experience. But you know, what are some hopes and dreams that you have for your children and for society as we go forward and as they grow up?
No, that's a great question. You know, it's one that I've had to think about even most recently, since my wife just had a baby a week ago. I'm a father of 3 girls and just had my first son. Now, those thoughts are different, right? Now that I have a son. But if I were to summarize it all, I would love for my children to grow up in a society where they're given the benefit of the doubt. That they, that not based off of how they look or the color of their skin or who they choose to date or who they, you know, and when I say who they choose to date, you know, talking about interracial marriages and whatnot, because that's still an issue for some people. I would love to
experiences with that.
Right. I would love to have a society where they have educational opportunities afforded to them, that their culture won't be swept away by attempts to erase certain aspects of history from the history books. I would love for them to have opportunities to the American dream and to gain wealth and all those other things, and the pursuit of happiness, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, all those other things. I would love for them to have that. I would love them to just be able to not be concerned that, how they look may threaten others or they may be attacked by others. But most of all, I would like them to be able to pass on a legacy to their children that builds upon that. You mentioned a while back that it seems like we may have reverted back a few years, right, in relation to where society is. I would like what we achieve today to be their floor and not their ceiling.
Yeah.
That's what I'm shooting for.
Wonderful. So, Chris, are there things that you would like to talk about that I haven't asked you about?
I mean, we can. This is a conversation that I can have all day. It's really, a lot of people have asked, what can we do, right? What can I do? I'll never forget. Someone once told me, they said, the problem with you, Chris, is that you think you can change the world. And I say, yeah, that I do think that, but just one conversation changes the world.
Yeah.
Right. And that is really big. I'll never forget an experience I had, and I tell people of this experience. I grew up in an all-black neighborhood in Houston, and I went to college in Iowa. Now, we understand that Iowa is not a predominantly black state by any means. So my experience was different. I experienced racism. I experienced, being thrown down by the police. I experienced being called the N-word and being told to go back to Africa. I experienced, students coming and saying, other white students had attacked them. And I experienced having to walk in groups for our safety. I experienced those things. But in all of that, I also experienced how God turned someone around. I experienced how God really showed someone my heart, and I saw their true heart, despite our experiences. And I say that because, I went to school. I had to deal with some challenges in school, but there came a point where I couldn't pay for school. I couldn't graduate. My mother had passed away and everything, and the one person that stepped up and paid for the rest of my education was a white man who historically didn't like black people because he was often beat up by black people. And that in of itself shows me how one conversation or one instance can change the dynamics of someone else and someone's heart, and God can intervene. Mm-hmm. And I wouldn't be talking to you today. Who knows what would have happened, if he didn't step up and would have gotten away from his experiences and the pain of his experiences. And who knows where I would have been. I may have made different choices. I may have been forced to go home. I may have been gone back to, my environment that I was used to. Who knows? So, one act, one conversation, despite what your experiences are or have been, can literally change someone's world. And so I don't care if you get nothing else from this, continue having the conversations. Ask the hard questions.
Yeah.
And let's talk. Let's have the dialogue. But we both have to be vulnerable enough to say, hey, let's now move forward. And we can move forward together.
So since you were talking about Iowa, I got to share kind of a funny story. So I went to seminary in Iowa, and that was right after I'd come out of Army in Louisiana and up in Dubuque. And so one of the first things they have us go through is an anti-racism workshop.
Mm-hmm.
And I I mean, I'd been through some type of things with that in the Army as well, but it just really didn't occur to me that a vast majority of my classmates were coming from Iowa and, rural Illinois and Wisconsin, and many of them had not experienced growing up around other cultures, other perspectives. And again, it was just, I remember walking around a mall one time in Dubuque and walking around saying, I'm just realizing for the first time, I'm not seeing any Latinos. I'm not seeing any Black Americans. I'm not seeing Asian American. I'm just seeing people who look like me. And that just really felt weird.
Yeah, absolutely. That's one of the reasons why I actually went away, because I knew that the world was not just a Black world, and I wanted to have those different experiences. Not to bring a somber experience in, but I remember I was a peer mentor for students, and a student had come in crying because we had community showers back then, right? And so a student had come in crying because several white girls had come to her and turned her around and looked and was like, "Hey, my mother was wrong. You guys don't have tails." She was just heartbroken. It was a freshman coming into that experience. And I'm like, wow. But there were so many people that had not experienced, Black people or Hispanics or whatever. And so, some of it, it's like, okay, when we investigated, the girl hadn't had experiences with others.
Yeah.
Now, the way she went about it was all wrong. But again, that tells me, hey, this is something that was passed down.
Yeah.
So, we have an obligation to, one, have discussions and open up to one another, but we also have an obligation to pass down truth to our children, and not fear. Pass down love, not fear, right? The Bible says perfect love casts out fear. So, let's pass down love. Let's teach them how to love regardless of who it is, and not, pass down those other things. So that's one of the things that really showed. It's like, man, okay, this 19-year-old girl is having experienced this, but it was also passed down from someone else.
Yeah. Well, and again, we learn things from our family, we learn things from our environment, we learn things in school, and not necessarily that it was taught by the school curriculum, although sometimes maybe it was, but you hear things passed around on the school ground or whatever happens, and then again you encounter somebody and wait a minute, you don't match what I've been told,
Right.
And again, I know I certainly probably had things. Well, I know I've had things I've had to unlearn as I've become an adult and as I've gotten to know other people. I think there's probably things we all have to unlearn.
Right.
All right. Well, again, thank you for this time. Thank you for making yourself available. I hope you know that you continue in my prayers, you and Northridge, and again, as we together try to navigate this time in society and in the world, I hope it can be a time where we can work towards that hope that we have, the hope where, people can be judged by who they are, that they're given that benefit of the doubt.
Right.
And again,
well, thank you. I appreciate it. If there are any other times you want to talk, let's not make this the last time.
Yeah.
Reach out. I love having these conversations. Like I said, I think this is just the start of what we must do as a body of believers in Christ. And I also believe that, it's our responsibility to lead the charge in establishing that compassionate culture, even in Frisco, as we're here. And so, you know, when you look at it, you know, we should be able to build a bridge, you know, from my church to your church that's just a few miles away,
Yeah.
right? Or it really, you know, we really should be able to do that and be the example, and be the standard. So let's not let this be the last time. I'm always here. Maybe, you know, it's been difficult getting in touch with me lately, but, you know, we'll find some normalcy in our little kingdom over here,
Yeah.
my home. But no, you know, I really appreciate you reaching out, and I thank you, and hopefully your congregation will love it.
Yeah. Well, again, best wishes to you, your family. Stay well, stay healthy, stay sane with a newborn, and we'll talk again.
Right. Good deal. Thanks, Bill.
Thanks, Chris.